The summer morning of July 6, 2001, arrived in Chicago's South Side like any other. The sun climbed over Lake Michigan, casting long shadows across the Lake Grove Village apartments on South Lake Park Avenue. Inside apartment 304, two little girls slept in the living room where it was cooler, their bodies curled against the heat that had already begun to seep through the windows. Tionda Bradley, 10 years old, and Diamond Bradley, just 3, had no way of knowing that when the sun rose that morning, they would be stepping into a mystery that would haunt a city for decades. This was supposed to be an ordinary day. A camping trip was planned. Their older sisters had spent the night at their grandmother's apartment. Their mother would leave for work early, as she always did, trusting Tionda with the same instructions she'd given countless times before. Don't open the door for anyone. Don't leave the apartment. Wait for me to come home. But somewhere between dawn and noon on that Friday in July, something went terribly wrong. The girls vanished. No screams. No struggle. No witnesses. Just silence where laughter should have been. And in their place, a single note that would raise more questions than it answered. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. This is Tionda and Diamond's story. It begins not with their disappearance, but with the life they lived in a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, where children played in the streets until the streetlights came on, where trust was currency and fear was kept at arm's length. The Bradley family was woven into the fabric of Chicago's South Side. Tracy Bradley, a single mother of 4 daughters, worked at the Robert Taylor homes preparing meals for residents. Her eldest daughter, Rita, was 12. Victoria, 9, would turn 10 the day after the girls disappeared. Tionda, at 10 years old, carried herself with the maturity of someone much older. She was responsible, protective, what family members called a little mama to her younger siblings. She loved to dance, her body moving to rhythms only she could hear, her feet light on any surface. She knew phone numbers by heart and would call family members just to say hello, her voice bright with that particular confidence some children possess before the world teaches them to doubt themselves. And then there was Diamond. 3 years old, quiet where Tionda was outspoken, shy where Tionda was bold. Diamond had a sweet smile that would peek around corners, watching her older sister dance, wanting to join but holding back. She could say about 20 words, family members would later recall, each one precious in its rarity. The apartment complex where they lived sat in the Oakland neighborhood, a collection of mid-rise buildings that housed hundreds of families. Doolittle Elementary School was 2 blocks away, the school where Tionda was enrolled in summer classes. The Jewel-Osco grocery store stood across from the school in the Lake Meadows Shopping Center. Lake Michigan stretched to the east, its beaches a refuge from the summer heat. This was their world. Small, contained, familiar. The Bradley girls split their time between their mother's apartment and their grandmother Martha's place in the Robert Taylor homes, where extended family took turns watching each other's children the way communities do when everyone understands that survival requires collective effort. On the evening of July 5, 2001, Tracy Bradley made a decision. She was planning to take Tionda and Diamond on a camping trip to Lake Schaefer in Indiana the next day. Her boyfriend, George Washington, would be joining them. But Tracy couldn't afford to take all 4 daughters. She promised Rita and Victoria they would go the following week, and that Thursday evening, she dropped them off at their grandmother Martha's apartment. The plan was simple. Tracy would work her morning shift on Friday, July 6th, then return home to pick up Tionda and Diamond for the camping trip. Rita and Victoria watched their younger sisters that evening, unaware it would be the last time they'd see them. Around 4:30 in the morning on July 6th, George Washington arrived at Tracy's apartment. This detail would later become crucial, though at the time it seemed unremarkable. Washington had been dating Tracy on and off for several years, though their relationship was complicated by questions of paternity and the instability that often marks relationships built on uncertain foundations. Around 6 o'clock that morning, Washington drove Tracy to her job at the Robert Taylor homes. The girls were still asleep in the living room when their mother left, tucked into the coolest spot in the apartment. Tracy's instructions were clear and familiar. Tionda had heard them before. Keep the door locked. Don't let anyone in. Don't go anywhere. Wait for me. The morning hours passed quietly in apartment 304. At least, no one heard anything unusual. No shouts for help. No sounds of struggle. The apartment building's security cameras were positioned in such a way that they captured only the ceilings, angled upward rather than toward the hallways where someone might have seen something, anything, that could explain what was about to unfold. Between 7 and 9 o'clock that morning, Tracy called home repeatedly. She called 3 times during that window, according to phone records. Each time, the phone rang unanswered. This was unusual. Tionda always answered. She was responsible like that. She understood that when her mother called, you picked up the phone. But on July 6th, the phone kept ringing into empty space. Other calls came in as well. Phone records show several incoming calls to the apartment that morning, all of them going unanswered. 2 of those calls registered as hang-ups. Whether the caller heard something that made them disconnect, or whether the line simply went dead, no one knows. But the silence on the other end would later feel like a premonition. Tracy tried to tell herself the girls were sleeping. Summer mornings could stretch long when you were young, and the heat made everything feel slower. Maybe they'd fallen into that deep sleep that comes in the early hours, when the world is still and dreams haven't yet given way to waking. She called her mother, Martha. Had she heard from the girls? No. Martha tried calling the apartment herself. Still no answer. The worry began as a flutter, that sensation in your chest when something doesn't feel right, but you can't yet name what's wrong. Tracy borrowed money from a neighbor so she could buy food at the Jewel-Osco for the camping trip. She went through the motions of her day, but the unease grew with each passing hour. Around 11:30 that morning, Tracy returned home. Some reports say George Washington was with her. Others say she came alone. The details blur in the retelling, as details often do when memory is filtered through trauma and time. What is certain is what she found when she opened the door to apartment 304. Silence. Complete, absolute silence. No television playing cartoons. No sound of little feet running across the floor. No voices calling out, "Mama," the way children do when a parent walks through the door. Tracy walked through the apartment calling their names. Tionda. Diamond. The words echoed back at her from empty rooms. The living room where they'd slept was empty. Their bedroom held only the still presence of abandoned toys and unmade beds. The bathroom was vacant. The kitchen offered no answers. And then she saw it. On the back of the couch in the living room, a note. Written in what appeared to be Tionda's handwriting. The note explained everything and nothing all at once. It said the girls had gone to the store and then to the playground. Simple. Innocent. The kind of note a responsible 10-year-old might leave for her mother. Except Tionda didn't write notes. She called. That's what family members would say later. If Tionda needed to tell her mother something, she picked up the phone. She knew the numbers by heart. She would have called. And there was something else about the note that troubled those who knew Tionda best. The grammar was too perfect. The spelling too advanced. The handwriting too neat. Yes, FBI forensic analysts would later confirm that Tionda had written the note. But the family's question wasn't whether her hand had formed the letters. It was whether someone had stood over her, telling her exactly what to write. "Mom, we're going to the store then the playground." Did someone watch as she wrote those words? Did she know what was coming next? The note sat on the back of the couch like a ghost of normalcy, a piece of paper that tried to explain an ordinary childhood excursion but instead marked the last moment before everything fractured into unknowing. Tracy began calling neighbors and family members. Had anyone seen the girls? Did anyone know where they were? Her sister Faith picked up Rita and Victoria from their grandmother's house, and soon the entire extended family was spreading out across the neighborhood, calling the girls' names, checking the places children go. They searched the Ida B. Wells housing complex where the girls had friends. They walked to the 31st Street beach where on hot summer days, children waded into Lake Michigan's cool water. They crossed the bridge over the busy expressway, hoping to intercept 2 small figures making their way home. But no one had seen Tionda or Diamond. The Jewel-Osco where the note said they were going held no memory of them. The playground at Doolittle Elementary was empty. The children who played there that morning would later tell conflicting stories. Some said they saw the girls. Others said they didn't. Some mentioned a fair-skinned man in a trench coat approaching Tionda, speaking briefly with her. But even this detail was uncertain, refracted through the unreliable lens of children's memories and the desperate need for any information, any clue, any thread to pull. As the afternoon stretched toward evening, the reality began to settle into Tracy Bradley's bones. Her daughters were gone. She'd searched everywhere she could think of. She'd called everyone she knew. And still, Tionda and Diamond were nowhere. At approximately 6:30 that evening, nearly 12 hours after she'd last seen her daughters sleeping in the living room, Tracy Bradley called the Chicago Police Department to report them missing. The search that would follow would become one of the largest missing persons investigations in Chicago's history. But that first night, as darkness fell on July 6, 2001, the question was simple and terrible. Where are the girls? Before we continue with what happened next, it's important to understand who Tionda and Diamond were before they became case numbers and age-progressed photographs. Tionda Bradley was born on January 20, 1991. From the moment she could walk, she danced. Not the self-conscious shuffling of children who know they're being watched, but uninhibited movement that came from somewhere deep inside her. Family members would say, "Dance for me, baby." And Tionda would dance until she was breathless, her body expressing what words sometimes couldn't. She was wildly outspoken, her Aunt April would recall, extremely mature for her age. A little sassy in the way that confident children can be before the world teaches them to make themselves smaller. She could cook basic meals by the time she was 10, taking care of her younger siblings with a sense of responsibility that made her seem older than her years. She earned ribbons running track. She knew phone numbers without having to look them up. She called her great-aunt Shalia just to talk, her voice carrying that particular joy of a child who hasn't yet learned that silence is sometimes safer than speaking. At Doolittle Elementary, she was known as a good student. Smart. Helpful. The kind of child teachers remember fondly, who bridges the gap between childhood playfulness and emerging adolescent awareness. Diamond Yvette Bradley was born on November 25, 1997. Where Tionda was outspoken, Diamond was quiet. Where Tionda commanded attention, Diamond observed from safe distances. She had a sweet smile that she'd peek around corners to share, watching her older sister dance with an expression that suggested she wanted to join but wasn't quite ready. Her vocabulary stretched to about 20 words, each one carefully chosen and delivered with the seriousness of someone who understood that words mattered. She was, by all accounts, a gentle child. The kind who curled up under her mother at home, seeking comfort in physical closeness. She loved to jump from couch to couch, that universal childhood game of avoiding invisible lava on the floor. At just 3 years old, Diamond's personality was still forming, still unfolding like a flower that hadn't yet fully bloomed. But those who knew her speak of a sweetness, a quiet presence that made people want to protect her. The sisters had different fathers, a fact that would become crucial to the investigation. Tionda's father was rumored to be a Moroccan man who had been paying child support under the mistaken belief that he was her biological parent. Diamond's father was George Washington, Tracy Bradley's on-again, off-again boyfriend, though this wouldn't be confirmed until after the girls disappeared. The Bradley family dynamics were complex in the way that many families are, especially those navigating poverty, single parenthood, and the challenges of raising children in neighborhoods where resources are scarce and threats are many. But within that complexity was love. The kind of love that shows up in grandmothers taking in grandchildren for weekends so their mother can work. The kind that appears in aunts and great-aunts who answer late-night phone calls just to say hello to a 10-year-old who wants to talk. The kind that exists in older sisters promising younger ones that they'll go camping next week, not knowing there won't be a next week. This love would become the engine of the search that followed. It would sustain the family through 2 decades of not knowing. It would fuel vigils and balloon releases and Facebook pages and conversations with psychics and private investigators and journalists and anyone who might help bring the girls home. But on the morning of July 6, 2001, all that love couldn't answer the question of where they had gone. The response from law enforcement was swift, particularly notable given the historical tensions between police departments and black communities. Often, when black children go missing, there's a delay, a sense that perhaps they're runaways, or that the circumstances are somehow less urgent than when white children disappear. But in this case, Whether because of the girls' ages or the circumstances or simply because the right people in the right positions made the right call, Chicago mobilized. Within hours of Tracy's report, Chicago Police Department officers flooded the neighborhood. The FBI was brought in almost immediately. This wasn't the usual response for a missing persons case, and family members noted the difference, grateful even as they wondered why it had taken this particular disappearance to generate this particular level of attention. By the next morning, Saturday, July 7th, the search had expanded exponentially. Hundreds of law enforcement officers joined the effort. Federal agents worked alongside local police. Civilian volunteers, neighbors and strangers alike, showed up to help search. They walked the streets calling the girls' names. They checked sewers, afraid of what they might find. They searched abandoned buildings and factories, those empty spaces that cities forget about until they become relevant to tragedy. Cadaver dogs were brought in, their noses trained to detect death. The dogs worked through the neighborhood, but they found nothing. Helicopters flew overhead, cameras scanning the ground below for any sign of two small figures. Divers suited up and searched the murky waters of Lake Michigan, looking for bodies no one wanted to find. The search radius expanded from blocks to miles. Officers knocked on doors, interviewing anyone who might have seen something. Nearly 100 registered sex offenders living in the area were questioned. Each one was ruled out. The search lasted for weeks. At one point, it was described as the largest missing persons search in Chicago's history. 824 tips came in. People called with theories, with sightings, with information both credible and fantastical. Every tip was followed. Every lead was investigated. But nothing brought the girls closer to home. The search became a community event. For 40 consecutive nights, family members and neighbors gathered to pray. They held hands in circles, their voices rising in gospel hymns that echoed off the buildings and trees. A young minister named Bamani Abadil organized the prayer vigils, understanding that hope required ritual, that grief needed structure. If they come home, I want the girls to know that there were people who loved and cared about them, Abadil said. The vigils continued even when hope began to feel like something heavy rather than buoyant. They continued because stopping felt like giving up, and giving up felt like betrayal. Then, 2 months later, the world shifted. On September 11, 2001, planes flew into the Twin Towers in New York City. The Pentagon burned. Another plane crashed in Pennsylvania. Nearly 3,000 people died in a single morning. And suddenly the nation's attention turned toward terrorism and war and security and fear on a scale that made individual tragedies feel smaller by comparison. The search for Tionda and Diamond didn't stop, but it slowed. Media coverage dried up. The daily updates became weekly, then monthly, then occasional. Resources that had been dedicated to finding two missing girls from Chicago's South Side were redirected toward national security. The tips that had been coming in at a steady pace began to trickle, then stopped almost entirely. This is what happens when national tragedy eclipses local loss. It's not that people stopped caring. It's that they stopped paying attention. And in cases like this, attention is everything. The investigation continued, but it shifted from active search to cold case much faster than it should have. Questions that should have been pressed harder went soft. Evidence that needed follow-up got filed away. The momentum that might have led to answers dissipated into the larger currents of history. But the Bradley family didn't stop. They couldn't. 20 years later, Tionda Bradley Smith, the girl's great-aunt, would say, "I get so consumed in trying to find the girls that it sometimes still feels like it's 2001 again. It's like no time has passed, and we're right back there on that July day when they disappeared." This is what unsolved cases do to families. They freeze you in the moment of loss, unable to move forward because moving forward feels like leaving someone behind. While the public search was happening, while helicopters flew and volunteers walked the streets, investigators were working another angle. They were looking at the people closest to the girls. The statistics on missing children are clear. The vast majority of child abductions are committed by someone known to the child. Strangers account for a small percentage of cases, despite the cultural fear of stranger danger that dominated American parenting in the late 20th century. If someone took Tionda and Diamond, probability suggested it was someone they knew, someone they trusted enough to go with willingly, someone who knew they would be alone that morning. This is where the investigation began to focus. And this is where the story becomes more complicated. There was the note, allegedly written by Tionda, saying they were going to the store and playground. FBI forensic analysis confirmed the handwriting was Tionda's. But was it written under duress? Did someone stand over her, coaching her on what to write? The family believed so. The grammar was too advanced for a 10-year-old. The spelling too perfect. And Tionda didn't write notes, she made phone calls. If she needed to communicate with her mother, she picked up the phone. Then there was the voicemail. This piece of evidence is particularly frustrating because its existence is both confirmed and disputed, depending on who's telling the story. According to Faith Bradley Catherine, one of the girl's aunts, she checked Tracy's voicemail the morning after the disappearance. Tracy had not checked her messages herself. Faith knew all the pins for the family phone plan, and she decided to see if there was anything there that might help. What she found was a message from Tionda. The exact wording is disputed, but the core content is consistent across retellings. Tionda said something like, Mom, answer the phone. George is at the door with the cake. Or possibly, George is here. He says we're coming to pick you up from work, and we're going to Jules to get the cake. The message referenced someone named George. This immediately created confusion because there were two people in the girls' lives who went by some version of that name. One was George Washington, Tracy's boyfriend and Diamond's father. The other was a neighbor and family friend who the children knew by a first name that sounded like George, though his actual nickname was different. Family members insist that if Tionda were referring to the neighbor, she would have used his nickname, not his given name. Therefore, the consensus among those who heard the voicemail was that Tionda was talking about George Washington. The voicemail, if authentic, would be crucial evidence. It would establish that someone came to the door that morning. It would provide a time frame for when the girls might have left or been taken. It would allow investigators to analyze Tionda's tone of voice, listen for background sounds, determine if there was any indication of distress. But here's where the story fractures into competing narratives. Faith Bradley Catherine says the entire family listened to the message, as did FBI agents who were at the apartment. After that day, the voicemail disappeared. Faith thinks it may have been accidentally deleted. Tracy Bradley says she never heard it. Shalia Bradley Smith says it disappeared, but won't elaborate on what that means. P. Foster, a private investigator hired by the family, was cagey when asked about it, but suggested that the FBI might have it. The only certainty is that the Chicago Police Department does not have it in their evidence locker. Ed Carroll, a retired cold case detective who worked the case, says he begged anyone who might have the recording to share it with him. I told them I'd go anywhere in the United States to find it, he said, but no one could ever tell me where it was. The disappearance of critical evidence in a high-profile case raises obvious questions. Was the voicemail actually deleted by accident? Was it deliberately suppressed? Does it exist somewhere in an FBI file that hasn't been shared with local investigators? Or is the memory of the voicemail itself a kind of collective misremembering, a story that got told and retold until it became fact, even if it never actually existed? Without the recording, it's impossible to know. But the fact that multiple people claim to have heard it, including law enforcement officers, suggests it was real. And if it was real, its disappearance represents a catastrophic failure in evidence handling. On the day the girls disappeared, July 6, 2001, Chicago police brought both Tracy Bradley and George Washington in for questioning. They were separated and interviewed for approximately 22 hours. This is an extraordinarily long interview, the kind reserved for when investigators believe they're close to getting a confession or breaking through a story that isn't holding up under scrutiny. Both Tracy and George took polygraph tests. According to police sources, both passed. However, Foster, the family's private investigator, said George's test was inconclusive. This discrepancy matters. A past polygraph suggests the person is telling the truth. An inconclusive result suggests the test couldn't determine truth from deception, which often happens when someone is highly anxious or employing countermeasures. After the initial questioning, both Tracy and George hired lawyers. This is their constitutional right, and in many cases, it's the smartest thing a person can do when being questioned by police, guilty or innocent. But it also effectively ended the opportunity for investigators to have open conversations with them. With lawyers present, questions become more limited. Spontaneous revelations become less likely. The investigation shifted from active interrogation to more careful, structured inquiries. Police and FBI maintained periodic contact with both Tracy and George over the years, but the initial window where investigators might have pressed harder had closed. Tracy Bradley has never been named a suspect in her daughter's disappearance. But the delay in reporting them missing, approximately 12 hours from when she last saw them to when she called police, raised questions. Why wait so long? Tracy's explanation was practical. She was searching herself. She was calling family and neighbors. She was trying to find them before involving authorities. But there's another layer to consider. In communities where interactions with police have historically led to negative outcomes, particularly for Black families, there's a reasonable hesitation to call law enforcement. There's the fear that Child Protective Services will get involved and remaining children will be taken away. There's the knowledge that mothers, especially Black mothers, are often blamed first and believed last. Tracy had already experienced this within her own family. Her sister's children had been removed by DCFS. This wasn't abstract fear. This was lived reality. So when Tracy waited to call police, was it because she had something to hide? Or was it because she knew that the moment she made that call, her life would be scrutinized, her parenting questioned, her choices dissected by people who had never walked in her shoes? The family's suspicions, however, began to center not on Tracy, but on George Washington. And the evidence, circumstantial though it was, gave them reasons to wonder. George Washington had been in a relationship with Tracy Bradley since the mid-1990s. It was an on-again, off-again arrangement, unstable and complicated. Rita and Victoria, Tracy's older daughters, barely knew him. They'd never been to his apartment. He rarely came around during the day. Their interactions with him were limited to nights when he'd come over after they'd gone to bed, leaving before morning. This secrecy should have been a red flag. But in relationships marked by complexity and compromise, red flags often get ignored until it's too late. Diamond, the 3-year-old, was his biological daughter. But this wasn't confirmed until after the girls disappeared. Tracy had filed a paternity lawsuit against him just a month before the disappearance. The test results came back after July 6th, definitively proving George was Diamond's father. But during the time leading up to the disappearance, this was still in question. George reportedly had not been eager to accept paternity. Children are expensive. Children come with obligations. And if George Washington did not want those obligations, if he resented the pressure to claim Diamond as his own, that resentment could have metastasized into something darker. But this is speculation. The evidence suggests possibility without proving certainty. Here's what is known. On the morning of July 6th, George Washington drove Tracy to work around 6 o'clock. After dropping her off, George told police he went home and did not return to the apartment. But according to later testimony from Detective Pam Childs, who would eventually form a task force to reinvestigate the case, Tracy had lied about being home the evening of July 5th. New information suggested that Tracy had actually spent the night at George's place, meaning the girls had been left alone overnight, not just for a few hours that morning. This extended the window of vulnerability. This meant the girls had been unsupervised for far longer than initially reported. If true, and if George knew the girls were alone all night, that knowledge changes the timeline and the opportunities for someone to act. George Washington also made calls that morning. Phone records show approximately 40 calls between George and Tracy in the 24 hours surrounding the disappearance. But there were two notable gaps in George's phone activity. Between 7 and 9 in the morning, his phone was silent. Between 5 and 6:30 that evening, silent again. These gaps align with crucial windows. The morning gap is when the girls would have been taken. The evening gap is when Tracy was searching frantically before calling police. Cell phone tower pings placed George's phone near forest preserves and the Little Calumet River during some of these calls. These are locations where bodies could be hidden, where someone might dispose of evidence. But tower pings are not GPS coordinates. They tell you the general area, not the specific location. George could have been driving past those areas, or he could have been stopping. The data doesn't specify. Then there's the matter of the camping trip. George had supposedly planned a camping trip to Lake Schaefer in Indiana for himself, Tracy, Tionda, and Diamond. But when investigators looked into this, they found no campground reservations, no receipts for camping supplies, no evidence of actual planning beyond verbal mentions. Why plan a camping trip for only 2 of Tracy's 4 daughters? Why exclude Rita and Victoria? The family believed George wanted to separate the girls, taking the younger two away from their sisters, away from other adults who might ask questions. But again, this is interpretation built on circumstantial foundation. On July 11th, 5 days after the girls disappeared, police searched George Washington's home. According to one source from the Chicago Tribune, nothing was found. But according to other reports from the Black and Missing Foundation, investigators discovered receipts dated July 7th, the day after the disappearance. The receipts were for neoprene gloves, gardening gloves, and heavy-duty contractor trash bags. 5 of the bags were missing from the box. These are the kinds of purchases someone might make for legitimate reasons. Home projects, yard work, cleaning. Or they're the kinds of purchases someone might make when they need to handle evidence, when they need to move something they don't want to leave traces on, when they need to dispose of something permanently. A neighbor reported seeing George burning something in a 50-gallon drum in the days following the disappearance. Again, this could be innocent. People burn trash, especially in neighborhoods where waste management is irregular. Or it could be something else entirely. Police also found evidence of charring in George's garage. Without knowing what was burned, it's impossible to say whether this is relevant. But the timing is suspicious. During the search of George's vehicle, investigators found hair in the trunk. Tests determined the hair could potentially belong to Diamond, Tionda, or Tracy, all of whom share maternal DNA. This doesn't definitively prove anything. George had been in a relationship with Tracy for years. Her DNA would reasonably be in his car. And if the girls had ever ridden in his vehicle, their hair could have transferred. George claimed the girls had ridden in his trunk once, during a trip to a drive-in movie theater where they thought it would be fun. But the nearest drive-in was nearly an hour away, and there's no evidence they actually went. The explanation feels thin, contrived, the kind of story someone tells when they need to account for physical evidence they know exists. All of this evidence is circumstantial. Suspicious purchases, suspicious locations, suspicious timeline gaps, but nothing that definitively proves George Washington hurt those girls. The legal standard for prosecution is guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. In this case, reasonable doubt was everywhere. There were other theories, other potential suspects. A registered sex offender who spent time around the girls later dedicated a book to them. The nature of his relationship with the family was unclear, as was his whereabouts on July 6th. Some family members reported that Tracy had given $5 to a relative that day, asking them to watch the girls at the apartment. If true, this person would have been one of the last to see them. But this detail has never been confirmed, and the identity of this relative, if they exist, has never been revealed. Another neighbor, someone the girls knew well enough to have a nickname for, allegedly once told Tracy that something bad would happen to the children if she kept leaving them alone. This sounds like a threat. It could also be clumsy advice from someone concerned about latchkey kids in a neighborhood with its share of dangers. Context matters, and without knowing exactly what was said and how, it's impossible to assess the significance. There was also the theory involving a Moroccan man. This man had been paying child support for Tionda, believing himself to be her father. Tracy had filed a paternity lawsuit against him the month before the girls disappeared. The lawsuit would eventually reveal that he was not biologically related to Tionda, that he had been deceived or mistaken about paternity. But before those results came back, there was speculation that he might have been angry about the lawsuit, or that he might have wanted to take Tionda. According to some reports, children playing at the playground that morning said they saw a fair-skinned man in a trench coat approach the girls. He spoke briefly with Tionda, then walked away. On a Chicago summer morning, a trench coat would be notable. It would stand out. The description loosely matched the physical appearance of the Moroccan man, and this detail sent investigators down a path that eventually led a local reporter to fly to Morocco searching for the girls. The search turned up nothing. No evidence Tionda or Diamond had ever been there. No connections that made sense. The theory collapsed under its own weight, but not before consuming resources and time that might have been better spent elsewhere. What's striking about this case is how many directions the investigation could have gone and how few of them led anywhere conclusive. In September 2002, more than a year after the disappearance, Tionda Bradley pushed a police officer who was asking her to come to the station to discuss new leads. She was handcuffed and taken to the station, not under arrest, but not exactly free to leave. Her attorney shut down the questioning before it could begin. After this incident, Tracy became less cooperative with investigators. She missed several scheduled appointments with police. From law enforcement's perspective, this looked like guilt, or at least like someone with something to hide. From Tracy's perspective, after more than a year of being questioned, suspected, and scrutinized while her daughters remained missing, cooperation probably felt less like a path toward answers and more like continued persecution. She had passed a polygraph. She had given dozens of interviews. And still, her girls were gone, and she was being treated like a suspect rather than a grieving mother. The relationship between Tracy Bradley and the investigation fractured during this period, and it never fully healed. To this day, Tracy has not returned calls from journalists seeking to discuss the case. She has largely retreated from public view, though she does attend the annual vigils her family holds every July 6th. What she knows, what she suspects, what she believes about that day remains largely private. Her silence is either the silence of someone who has nothing left to say after years of saying everything, or it's the silence of someone who knows more than she's willing to share. Without being able to speak with her directly, it's impossible to know which. In the years following the disappearance, cold case detective Ed Carroll took up the investigation with the determination of someone who understood that these cases don't solve themselves. Carroll spent considerable time reviewing evidence, re-interviewing witnesses, and pushing for a grand jury to convene. A grand jury can compel testimony, can force people who have been silent to speak under oath. Carroll believed that with a grand jury, he could finally get answers. He pushed Cook County to convene one. The response was no. The reasons given were never entirely clear, but the subtext was obvious. There wasn't enough evidence to secure an indictment, let alone a conviction. Presenting the case to a grand jury without sufficient evidence would be a waste of resources and would potentially compromise any future prosecution if new evidence emerged. This is the cruel calculus of criminal justice. Sometimes doing nothing is strategically smarter than doing something that fails. But for the Bradley family, this felt like abandonment. It felt like bureaucracy choosing caution over courage, choosing legal strategy over justice for two missing little girls. The FBI offered a $10,000 reward for information leading to the girls' whereabouts. This is standard in missing persons cases, an attempt to incentivize people who might know something to come forward. But $10,000, while significant to many people, is not life-changing money. It's not the kind of reward that makes someone risk their own safety or implicate people they care about. The reward stands to this day, unclaimed. Over the years, the case generated false leads and hoaxes that punctuated the family's grief with cruel episodes of hope and disappointment. In 2008, a photograph appeared on MySpace that looked remarkably similar to age-progressed images of Tionda. The girl in the photo was approximately the right age. Her features aligned closely with what forensic artists predicted Tionda would look like as a teenager. The family hired a forensic artist who believed, based on the photograph, that the girls were the same person. They reached out. They investigated. Eventually, the identity of the girl in the photo was determined, and it was not Tionda. The girl has since stayed in touch with Tionda Bradley Smith, aware of the pain her photograph caused, but also touched by a family's desperate hope. This happens more often than people realize. Faces that look similar from certain angles, in certain lighting, with certain expressions. Hope makes us see what we want to see, especially when what we want is to believe someone we love is still alive. In 2019, a woman in Texas responded to Shalia's Facebook post asking the girls to come home. The woman wrote, "We're trying." When Shalia began messaging her for specifics, asking questions only Diamond or Tionda would know, the woman's story began to unravel. Details didn't match. Stories changed. Eventually, it became clear this was another false lead, someone either genuinely confused about their own identity or deliberately manipulating a grieving family. This person was dismissed as just another in a long line of people who have claimed to be the Bradley sisters. Shalia said they've had about 12 such claims over the years, most of them easily dismissible. Each one takes an emotional toll. Each one requires investigation. Each one resurrects the trauma of that July morning when the girls disappeared. And each time the claim proves false, the family has to grieve again, has to return to not knowing, has to accept that today will not be the day their questions are answered. Then, in May 2023, another woman came forward. This time, the approach was different. A TikTok video surfaced showing a young black woman standing beside a police car. She claimed to be Diamond Bradley. She said she remembered being in a car with another girl, possibly Tionda. She said one day she woke up and her sister was gone. She claimed she recently escaped from whoever was holding her. When Tionda Bradley Smith first saw the video, she was skeptical. 22 years of false leads had taught her to guard her hope carefully. But then the woman did something no one else had done in all those years. She voluntarily contacted the FBI. She demanded DNA testing. She submitted fingerprints. She, according to Tionda, was eager to tear down the doors of the FBI to prove who she was. This eagerness felt different from previous claims. Usually, people who falsely claim to be missing persons avoid official channels. They tell their stories on social media or to family members, but when pressed to provide proof, they disappear. This woman was doing the opposite. She was seeking official verification. The woman had a scar on her forehead, similar to where Diamond had a scar. She was approximately the right age. She seemed genuinely convinced of her identity. The FBI took a DNA sample. They took fingerprints. They began the process of verification that would, finally, definitively determine whether this woman was Diamond Bradley. As of early 2024, those results had not been made public. The Department of Justice has a policy of not commenting on ongoing investigations, and the DNA results, if they've been completed, remain sealed. This is both protocol and torture for a family that has waited more than 2 decades for answers. Every day that passes without news is another day of not knowing. But it's also another day that hope remains technically alive. Schrodinger's missing persons case. Until the results are announced, Diamond is both found and still missing, both alive and possibly dead, both coming home and gone forever. Tionda Bradley Smith has been the face of the family's search for more than 20 years. In the days immediately following the disappearance, she sat in her blue Dodge Caravan in the parking lot of the apartment complex, watching, waiting, hoping to see something that would explain where the girls had gone. She sat there for a week, leaving only for brief periods to rest. She watched as carpet installers arrived to do work in one of the buildings. For a moment, she wondered if the rolled-up carpets could conceal 2 small bodies. Diamond was 3, Tionda was 10. Together, they weighed just over 100 pounds. It would be possible, physically, to hide them in rolled carpet. But there was no reason to suspect these particular workers, no evidence connecting them to the girls. Still, Tionda watched, because what else could she do? Every person became a potential suspect. Every vehicle became a possible escape route. Every shadow held the possibility of revelation. Tionda shaped her entire life around the search. She created Facebook pages dedicated to the girls, missing Diamond and Tionda Bradley, help find Tionda and Diamond Bradley. She posts regularly, keeping the case in public view, sharing age-progressed photos, pleading with whoever took the girls to let them come home. She chose career paths that would keep her close to information about missing persons. She networked with other families experiencing similar losses. She studied investigative techniques. She became, in effect, an unpaid, full-time private investigator working a case that law enforcement couldn't solve. Every year on July 6th, the family gathers for a vigil. The location has varied over the years. Sometimes they meet near the 35th Street Bridge, now replaced but still resonant with the memory of crossing it that first day, searching, calling the girls' names into the summer heat. Other times they gather at Robert Taylor Park on 47th Street, where Tionda and Diamond used to take dance and gymnastics classes when they visited their grandmother. The vigils have evolved over 20 years. Some years, they release balloons. Pink for the girls. White for God's divine love. Emerald for anniversaries. Other years, they release doves or floating lanterns. During the COVID-19 pandemic, they wore masks printed with the girls' faces. They sing hymns. They pray. They hold hands, sometimes 50 or more family members and community supporters, all of them believing, or trying to believe, that faith might bring the girls home. Motorcycle brigades show up. Lifelong friends and Facebook followers converge under the July sun. Tracy Bradley sometimes lifts her hand as she sings, as though her prayers might carry farther if her body reaches higher. The vigils serve multiple purposes. They keep the girls in public consciousness. They provide structure for the family's grief. They create space for hope in a situation defined by its absence. and they signal to whoever took Tionda and Diamond that this family has not forgotten, will not forget, will never stop searching. In 2010, Tionda Bradley Smith found herself in Crystal, Minnesota, searching for a missing boy named Barway Collins. Barway was 5 years old when he was reported missing in March of that year. Tionda had driven hours to help with the search, bringing her experience, her organizational skills, her deep understanding of what families go through when someone vanishes. On the morning of April 11th, she sat in her vehicle, cigarette smoke drifting toward the sky. It was cold, just above freezing. She spoke to whoever might be listening. Barway, you gotta help me today." She prepared to organize the day's canvas. She brought balloons to release. Blue for Barway, white for her prayers. She visited a nearby building that housed registered sex offenders, hoping someone would have information. When she returned to her van, her phone rang. A young boy's voice. For a moment, in Shalia's heart, it was Barway, safe and alive. "Is this Miss Smith?" The mind plays tricks when you've been looking for so long. Every voice becomes the voice you want to hear. But it wasn't Barway calling. It was another child with information that eventually led to the discovery of Barway Collins's body. He had drowned in the Mississippi River, his death ruled accidental. Shalia had helped find him, but she couldn't find her own nieces. This contradiction haunted her. She told journalists later, recounting the moment they found Barway. "How could you let me find someone else's, but not my own?" It's a question without an answer, a cry into the void that echoes back emptiness. There's something particularly cruel about being able to help other families find closure while your own family remains in limbo. It's generous and devastating in equal measure. The Bradley family has expanded in the years since Tionda and Diamond disappeared. Tracy had 2 more children after 2001. These younger siblings have grown up knowing they have 2 older sisters they've never met. Victoria and Rita, now adults themselves, have to explain to their younger siblings that somewhere in the world, or somewhere beyond it, are 2 girls who share their blood. Rita, who was 12 when her sisters vanished, is now a mother herself. The experience has changed how she parents, made her more protective, more cautious, more aware of how quickly safety can shatter. Victoria, who would have turned 10 the day after the disappearance, carries the particular burden of that timing. Her birthday is July 7th. Every year, the celebration of her life is shadowed by the anniversary of loss. This is generational trauma, the way absence ripples forward through time, affecting people who weren't even born when the original tragedy occurred. The younger siblings grow up in a house haunted by questions about children they'll never know. They see the balloon releases, attend the vigils, wear the t-shirts with their sisters' faces printed on them. They grow up understanding that their family is incomplete, that there are empty chairs at every table, that some wounds don't heal. They just become part of the landscape of daily life. The community response to the disappearance has also evolved over time. Initially, there was massive engagement, hundreds of volunteers, daily news coverage, public pressure on law enforcement to find answers. But as years became decades, attention waned. This is natural. Human minds are not built to sustain crisis-level attention indefinitely. We move on because we have to, because life continues regardless of unresolved tragedies. But for the Bradley family, moving on isn't an option. July 6, 2001, remains the central fact of their existence. Tionda Bradley Smith said it best. "I get so consumed in trying to find the girls that it sometimes still feels like it's 2001 again. It's like no time has passed, and we're right back there on that July day when they disappeared." This is temporal displacement. While the rest of the world has lived through 2 decades of history, wars and elections, technological revolutions and cultural shifts, the Bradley family remains frozen in that moment when they realized the girls were gone. The investigation technically remains open. The Chicago Police Department's Deputy Director Tom Ahern released a statement saying investigators continue to follow up on tips when they're received. The FBI maintains the case in their missing persons database. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children updates age-progressed photos every few years, showing what Tionda and Diamond might look like as they age. The most recent age progressions show Tionda at 30 years old and Diamond at 23. Looking at these images is disorienting. They depict adults the girls never got to become, at least not publicly, at least not in any way their family can witness. These are theoretical people, mathematical extrapolations of facial structures and aging patterns. They're helpful for identification purposes, but they're also ghost images, portraits of might have been. Shalaya looks at these photos and finds it hard to think of the girls as adults. But that's who we're looking for now, she said. We're not looking for children. We're looking for adults or remains. This is the reality 20+ years creates. If Tionda and Diamond are alive, they're no longer the children who disappeared. They're women. They might have children of their own. They might have jobs, relationships, whole lives built in circumstances the family can't imagine. If they're not alive, what remains to be found are bones, DNA, evidence of what happened rather than the living people themselves. Both possibilities are painful in different ways. The thought that they might be alive somewhere, unable to come home or unaware of their true identities, is torture. The thought that they've been dead for more than 20 years, that the family has spent 2 decades hoping for a reunion that was never possible, might be even worse. Hope is sustaining, but it's also exhausting. It requires believing something against accumulating evidence to the contrary. It requires ignoring statistics that say most missing children who aren't found within the first 48 hours are never found alive. Private investigator P. Foster has worked the case pro bono for years. He vows that every tip that comes in will be checked out, no matter how unlikely. Foster sometimes works with Ed Carroll, the retired detective. Sometimes they work separately. Both men understand that this case has become their responsibility in ways that extend beyond professional obligation. It's fallen on our backs, and we're not going to give up on it, Foster said. And I even told Ed, if it takes my children's children to find these girls, then that's what it's going to be. This is a promise that spans generations. It's also an acknowledgement that the case might never be solved in their lifetimes, that the search might outlive the searchers. There's something both noble and tragic about dedicating your life to a question that might never be answered. George Washington, for his part, maintains his innocence. In a rare interview decades after the disappearance, he said, "That was 20 years ago, and everyone tried to blame me. All 3 of them, the family, investigators, and the media, ganged up on me because they couldn't solve it." He's never been charged. He's never been officially named a person of interest, though investigators have made clear he remains someone they're interested in speaking with. Without new evidence, without something concrete that ties him directly to the girl's disappearance, he's free to live his life. Whether he's innocent or guilty, whether he knows what happened or is as baffled as everyone else, is something only he knows. Tracy Bradley continued her relationship with George Washington after the girls disappeared. They had another child together, a detail that has fueled speculation and criticism. How could she have another child with a man many believe harmed her daughters? The psychology here is complex. Trauma doesn't always lead to logical responses. Sometimes people cling to what's familiar, even when familiar is toxic. Sometimes they refuse to believe someone they love is capable of harm. Sometimes economic necessity or emotional dependency overrides better judgment. Or perhaps Tracy genuinely doesn't believe George was involved. Perhaps she knows something the rest of the family doesn't. Perhaps she's protecting him, or perhaps she's protecting herself from the unbearable knowledge that she trusted someone who betrayed that trust in the worst possible way. The case has been featured on numerous true crime shows and podcasts. Investigation Discovery produced an episode. Major news outlets return to the story on anniversaries. Each retelling brings brief, renewed attention, a spike in tips, a moment when it feels like maybe this time someone will remember something crucial. But so far, each burst of attention has faded without producing the breakthrough everyone hopes for. This is the nature of cold cases. They cycle through periods of public interest and periods of neglect, rising and falling in cultural consciousness, while the families live with them every single day. The broader implications of this case extend beyond the Bradley family. It highlights how missing Black children cases are often treated differently than cases involving white children. While the initial response to Tionda and Diamond's disappearance was robust, that's unusual. More often, there are delays, assumptions that the child is a runaway or that family dysfunction is to blame. Media coverage is less extensive. Resources are allocated differently. These disparities are well documented. The Bradley case got attention partly because the girls were so young, especially Diamond at only 3 years old. But it also got attention because the community demanded it, because the family refused to be silent, because Tionda Bradley Smith became a persistent, unavoidable presence keeping the case in public view. This shouldn't be necessary. Families shouldn't have to become advocates and investigators and media managers just to get authorities to take their missing children seriously. But in many cases, especially in marginalized communities, that's exactly what's required. The case also illuminates tensions between families and law enforcement during investigations. Police need to investigate everyone close to a missing person, including family members. Statistics justify this approach. But when families feel accused rather than supported, when they feel like suspects rather than victims, cooperation breaks down. This happened with Tracy Bradley. After more than a year of questioning, she stopped showing up for appointments with police. From her perspective, she'd done everything asked of her and was still being treated like a criminal. From the police perspective, her growing unwillingness to cooperate suggested she had something to hide. Both perspectives have merit, and neither brings the girls home. Trust between communities and law enforcement is fragile, particularly in neighborhoods with histories of police misconduct, racial profiling, and systemic neglect. The Bradley family's initial hesitation to call police, rooted in fear of Child Protective Services involvement, reflects this broader context. When the default expectation is that authorities will make things worse rather than better, people delay seeking help even in emergencies. And in missing persons cases, those delays can be fatal. The first 48 hours are crucial. Memories are fresh. Evidence hasn't been contaminated or destroyed. Leads haven't gone cold. Every hour that passes reduces the likelihood of a positive outcome. Tracy Bradley waited approximately 12 hours before calling police. By the time the investigation began in earnest, half a day had passed. Whether this delay affected the outcome is impossible to know, but it certainly didn't help. Another aspect of this case that deserves attention is the phenomenon of latchkey children and the judgment directed at parents who leave children unsupervised. Tracy Bradley left a 10-year-old in charge of a 3-year-old while she went to work. This is not uncommon in households where single parents must work to survive and childcare is expensive or unavailable. According to some estimates, 1 in 5 children in America can be considered latchkey kids at some point in their childhood. Yet when something goes wrong, the parent is immediately blamed. How could she leave them alone? Becomes the dominant question, as though parents have unlimited options and resources, as though systemic failures in childcare support and living wages bear no responsibility. This is not to say parental choices don't matter. They do. Leaving young children unsupervised carries risks. But the judgment directed at Tracy Bradley often lacks context about the impossible situations many working parents face, especially single mothers in economically disadvantaged neighborhoods. The larger question is why we've built a society where parents must choose between earning money to feed their children and being present to protect them, and why, when that untenable situation leads to tragedy, we blame the individual rather than examining the systems that created the choice. 24 years have now passed since July 6, 2001. Tionda would be 34 years old. Diamond would be 27. If they're alive, they're women, possibly mothers themselves, living lives their family knows nothing about. If they're not alive, their bodies have been hidden well enough that despite extensive searches, they've never been recovered. The passage of time makes certain kinds of evidence useless. Memories fade. Witnesses die or move away. Physical evidence degrades. Even if someone came forward today with information, prosecuting a case this old presents enormous challenges. Witnesses who could corroborate or contradict stories might no longer be available. Evidence that would have been definitive in 2001 might now be inadmissible or compromised. The legal standard remains beyond a reasonable doubt, and doubt multiplies with time. Yet the family continues hoping. They continue searching. They continue holding vigils every July 6th, releasing balloons and singing hymns and believing that somehow, some way, they'll get answers. This persistence is remarkable. It would be easier to give up, to accept that the girls are gone and move forward with life. But they don't. They can't. Because giving up feels like betrayal, like abandoning Tionda and Diamond a second time. So they keep vigil. They keep faith. They keep showing up year after year, holding space for grief and hope in equal measure. In 2021, on the 20th anniversary of the disappearance, family members gathered at two locations. First, near the pedestrian overpass to Lake Michigan, where they released 20 balloons while chanting, "We love you, Diamond," and Tionda. Pink for the girls. White for God's divine love. Emerald for the 20th anniversary. They walked the bridge the same way they did that first day, retracing steps that led nowhere then and lead nowhere now, but must still be taken. Later that day, they gathered at Robert Taylor Park. Despite 90-degree heat, more than 50 relatives showed up wearing t-shirts and buttons with the girls' faces on them. They held hands. They prayed. Tionda Bradley told reporters, "We have to keep them in the public eye, in the news, and hope it breaks through. We have to keep hope alive." She told NBC Chicago she believes her daughters were victims of a crime. Not an accident. Not a miscommunication. A crime. Someone took them. Someone knows what happened. And that someone has remained silent for more than 2 decades. The question that haunts every person familiar with this case is simple. Why hasn't anyone talked? In most crimes, someone eventually breaks. Co-conspirators turn on each other. Guilty consciences lead to deathbed confessions. New relationships lead to sharing secrets that should have stayed buried. 24 years is a long time to keep silent, especially about something as consequential as the disappearance of 2 children. The possibilities are limited. Either the person responsible acted alone and has no one to tell, or they've successfully intimidated or isolated anyone who knows, or the people who know don't realize the significance of what they know. There's also the possibility that someone has talked, that law enforcement has information they haven't shared publicly, that the case is closer to resolution than anyone realizes. But given the family's insistence that they're still waiting for answers, given the lack of arrests or charges, this seems unlikely. More probable is that whoever is responsible has simply decided that silence is survivable and confession is not. They've watched as years passed without consequences. They've seen the investigation lose momentum. They've calculated that the risk of coming forward outweighs the psychological burden of keeping quiet. And so far, they've been right. Detective Pam Childs, who formed a task force to reinvestigate the case after discovering that Tracy had lied about being home the evening of July 5th, represents law enforcement's continued engagement with the case. The revelation that the girls had been left alone overnight rather than for just a few morning hours was significant. It expanded the window when someone could have taken them. It changed the timeline. It meant re-examining everything investigators thought they knew. Childs has been described as determined, unwilling to let the case disappear into bureaucratic neglect. But determination alone doesn't solve cases. You need evidence. You need witnesses willing to talk. You need pieces of information that fit together into a coherent picture of what happened. And after 24 years, those pieces remain scattered, incomplete, contradicting each other in ways that prevent any definitive conclusion. The note Tionda allegedly wrote continues to be one of the most analyzed pieces of evidence in the case. FBI handwriting analysis confirmed she wrote it. But handwriting analysis can't tell you whether she wrote it willingly or under duress, whether someone was standing over her dictating what to say, whether she understood what was about to happen when she put pen to paper. The content of the note is simple. "Mom, we're going to the store than the playground." Some versions include more detail about which store and which playground, though these details vary depending on the source. What's consistent is that the note suggests an ordinary excursion, the kind of thing children do on summer mornings. But Tionda didn't write notes. She called. This is what family members emphasize repeatedly. If Tionda needed to communicate with her mother, she picked up the phone. She knew the numbers. She had been taught to call if anything came up. So why, on this particular morning, did she write a note instead? The family's theory is that someone told her to write it. Someone wanted to create a paper trail that explained the girl's absence in a way that wouldn't immediately trigger alarm. They went to the store buys time. It explains why the apartment is empty without suggesting anything sinister. By the time Tracy returned home and found the note, hours had already passed. Hours that could have been used to travel far from the neighborhood, to hide evidence, to establish alibis. If the note was written under coercion, it served its purpose. It delayed the response. But proving coercion is nearly impossible. The handwriting looks normal. There are no obvious signs of hesitation or shakiness that might indicate distress. If Tionda was scared when she wrote it, she didn't let that fear show in her penmanship. Or perhaps she wasn't scared. Perhaps she trusted whoever told her to write it. Perhaps she believed they really were going to the store, that this was normal, that her mother would understand. If someone the girls knew and trusted told them they were taking them on an adventure, would they have resisted? Or would they have gone willingly, excited for something different, unaware they were being led into harm? This is the nightmare scenario in any child abduction case. That the person responsible wasn't a stranger who had to use force, but someone familiar who used trust as a weapon. Children are taught about stranger danger, about not getting into cars with people they don't know, about screaming and running if someone tries to grab them. But they're less prepared for danger that wears a familiar face, that speaks in a voice they recognize, that uses affection or authority to manipulate rather than force to compel. If Tionda and Diamond went with someone they knew, there would be no struggle, no screams that neighbors might have heard, no obvious signs of resistance. They would have walked out of that apartment willingly, believing they were safe, never imagining they wouldn't be coming back. The apartment building's security cameras, positioned to capture ceilings rather than hallways, represent a failure that's almost comical if it weren't so tragic. Security cameras exist to provide safety and documentation. But if they're positioned incorrectly, they're useless. Worse than useless, actually, because they create a false sense of security. People believe they're being monitored when in reality, nothing useful is being recorded. This is what happened at Lake Grove Village Apartments. The cameras were there. They just weren't capturing anything that mattered. So when investigators needed to see who entered and exited the building on July 6th, when they needed to identify vehicles in the parking lot or people in the hallways, the footage was worthless. This single technical failure might have cost the girls their lives. If someone had seen footage of George Washington or anyone else returning to the building after dropping Tracy at work, if there was visual evidence of someone leaving with two small figures in tow, the case would have been solved quickly. But that evidence doesn't exist. And without it, every theory remains just that, a theory, speculation without proof. The geographical component of the case has also been analyzed extensively. Cell phone tower pings placed George Washington's phone near forest preserves and the Little Calumet River at various times on July 6th and the days following. These are locations where bodies could be concealed, where someone familiar with the area could hide evidence of a crime. The forest preserves around Chicago are vast. Thousands of acres of woods, wetlands, and undeveloped land. Searching them thoroughly would require enormous resources, and even then, there's no guarantee of finding anything. Bodies can be buried deep. They can be weighted down and submerged in water. They can be dismembered and scattered across multiple locations. Nature has a way of reclaiming what's left in it. Decomposition and scavengers rendering remains unrecognizable within months. If Tionda and Diamond's bodies were left in a forest preserve in July 2001, finding them now, 24 years later, would be extraordinarily difficult even if investigators knew exactly where to look. The Little Calumet River flows through South Chicago, a murky waterway that's been polluted by industrial activity for more than a century. It's deep in places, shallow in others, with currents that can move objects significant distances downstream. If bodies were weighted and placed in the river, they could have traveled miles before settling, if they settled at all. Some remains might have been washed into Lake Michigan, where the vastness of the water makes recovery nearly impossible. This is grim speculation, but it's the kind of calculation that has to be made in cases like this. If you're trying to hide a body, where would you put it? How would you ensure it wouldn't be found? And did George Washington, or whoever is responsible, have the knowledge and capability to successfully conceal two children's bodies for more than 2 decades? The purchases he allegedly made, contractor bags and gloves, support the theory that someone was preparing to handle remains. But people buy those items for innocent reasons all the time. Home improvement projects, cleaning, yard work. Without finding the bodies or other physical evidence connecting those purchases to the crime, they're just suspicious circumstances, not proof. The burn barrel sighting is similarly circumstantial. A neighbor reported seeing George Washington burning something in a 50-gallon drum in the days after the disappearance. But people burn trash, especially in neighborhoods where waste management is inconsistent. Garden waste, old papers, household refuse. The fact that George was burning something doesn't automatically mean he was destroying evidence. Except for the timing. Burning trash the week your girlfriend's daughters disappear looks suspicious regardless of what you're actually burning. Did he burn clothing the girls were wearing? Bedding that might have had blood or other evidence on it. Documents that connected him to the girls in ways he didn't want discovered? Or was he just burning trash, and the timing is unfortunate coincidence? Without knowing what was in that barrel, without any way to retrieve and analyze the ashes, it's impossible to say. But it adds to the accumulation of suspicious behaviors that, taken together, paint a picture of someone who had something to hide. The same is true of the alleged charring in George's garage. Fire can destroy DNA evidence, fiber evidence, anything that might connect someone to a crime scene. But garages get charred for lots of reasons. Mechanical work, heating equipment malfunctions, accidental fires that get quickly extinguished. Again, timing matters. If the charring appeared after July 6th, that's significant. If it predated the disappearance, it's irrelevant. The reports don't specify, leaving this as another detail that suggests guilt without proving it. This is the frustration of circumstantial cases. Each piece of evidence points in a direction, but not conclusively enough to secure a conviction. George Washington's phone being near forest preserves, plus suspicious purchases, plus burning something in a barrel, plus charring in his garage, plus hair in his trunk, plus gaps in his phone activity, plus being Diamond's biological father, plus having access to the girls, plus planning a camping trip that didn't seem to actually be planned. All of this together should be enough. It feels like it should be enough. But the legal standard is beyond a reasonable doubt, and defense attorneys are skilled at creating doubt. Any one of these pieces could have an innocent explanation. Taken together, they're suspicious, but are they proof beyond a reasonable doubt that George Washington killed those girls? A prosecutor would have to convince 12 jurors that yes, this evidence proves guilt, and there's no reasonable alternative explanation. Without bodies, without witnesses, without confessions, without forensic evidence definitively linking George to the crime, that's a difficult case to make. This is why Ed Carroll pushed so hard for a grand jury. Grand juries operate differently than trial juries. They don't determine guilt or innocence. They determine whether there's probable cause to believe a crime was committed and whether there's enough evidence to charge someone. The standard is lower. The process is secret. Witnesses can be compelled to testify. It's a tool prosecutors use to investigate, to gather information, to force people to speak under oath who might otherwise remain silent. In the Bradley case, a grand jury could have subpoenaed phone records, financial records, witness testimony. It could have required George Washington to testify about his whereabouts, his purchases, what he burned in that barrel. It could have required Tracy to testify about the actual timeline of events, about what she knew and when she knew it. It could have pursued leads that regular investigative work couldn't access. But Cook County declined to convene a grand jury. The stated reason was insufficient evidence. The real reason might be more complex. Grand juries are expensive. They tie up resources. And if you convene one and fail to get an indictment, you've potentially compromised any future prosecution. Double jeopardy doesn't apply to grand jury proceedings, but practically speaking, if you present your case and a grand jury says there's not enough evidence to charge, it becomes much harder to charge someone later even if new evidence emerges. So Cook County made a strategic decision. Wait. Hope for new evidence. Don't act until you're certain you can win. This is sound legal strategy. It's also maddening for a family that needs answers. Every day that passes without charges is another day their daughters remain missing. Another day whoever is responsible remains free. Another day the case grows colder and harder to solve. The psychological toll on the family cannot be overstated. Tionda Bradley Smith's description of feeling like no time has passed since 2001 is a recognized phenomenon in trauma psychology. When something catastrophic happens and is never resolved, the brain can't properly process and file the memory. It remains active, present tense, as though it's still happening. This is why people with PTSD re-experience traumatic events rather than simply remembering them. The past and present collapse into each other. For the Bradley family, every July 6th is both an anniversary and a reliving. Every age-progressed photo is both hope and grief. Every false lead is both possibility and disappointment. They exist in a state of prolonged crisis, unable to reach resolution, unable to move through grief into acceptance, because there's nothing definitive to accept. This is called ambiguous loss, and it's considered one of the most difficult types of grief to process. When someone dies, there's a body, a funeral, rituals that help survivors process the loss and begin healing. When someone goes missing, there's nothing. No body to bury. No certain knowledge of whether to grieve or hope. The person is simultaneously absent and present, gone but possibly findable, dead but maybe alive. This ambiguity freezes families in a state of not knowing that can last years or decades. Rita and Victoria Bradley have had to live their entire adult lives with this ambiguity. They were 12 and 9 when their sisters disappeared. They're now in their 30s, mothers themselves in some cases, living with the knowledge that they were the last family members to see Tionda and Diamond. They spent the evening of July 5th with them at their grandmother's house before being separated. Did they say goodbye? Did they hug? Did they have any sense that this was the last time they'd be together? Memory is unreliable, especially childhood memory, especially memory refracted through trauma. What they remember now might not be what actually happened. But the fact that they were separated that night, that they weren't at the apartment on July 6th, has probably haunted them. Survivor's guilt is real, even when there's no logical reason for it. If I had been there, could I have prevented it? If I had stayed at mom's instead of grandma's, would things have been different? These are unanswerable questions, but they echo through your mind regardless. Tracy Bradley's silence in recent years is understandable from multiple perspectives. She's been questioned, accused, suspected, and judged for more than 2 decades. She's had to defend leaving her children alone while she worked, defend her relationship choices, defend her delay in calling police, defend everything about how she lived her life and raised her daughters. At some point, you stop trying to defend yourself because it doesn't matter what you say. People have already decided what they believe. Her continued relationship with George Washington after the disappearance has been particularly controversial. The family suspects George. Investigators suspect George. But Tracy stayed with him, even had another child with him. This could mean she knows he's innocent and is standing by someone she loves. It could mean she's in denial, unable to accept that someone she trusted could harm her children. It could mean she's economically dependent on him and can't afford to leave. It could mean she knows something that makes her complicit and staying with George is safer than leaving and potentially becoming a target herself. Or it could mean something else entirely, something no one outside her head can fully understand. Human behavior in crisis is rarely logical or easily explained. People do things that seem irrational to outside observers, but make perfect sense within the context of their own experience, their own fears, their own understanding of their options. Judging Tracy's choices without understanding her full situation is easy. Empathizing with her is harder, but probably more accurate. She's a mother who lost 2 daughters. Whether she bears some responsibility for that loss through her choices, or whether she's a victim of circumstance and predation, she's still living with an unfathomable loss. She still wakes up every day in a world where Tionda and Diamond aren't there. That's her punishment, regardless of guilt or innocence. And it's a punishment that never ends. The community's role in this case has been significant. Chicago, particularly the South Side, has embraced the Bradley family's search in ways that are touching and important. The initial 40 nights of prayer vigils, led by Minister Bamani Abadil, created a structure for communal grief and hope. Neighbors and strangers showed up evening after evening, holding hands with people they didn't know, united in the shared human response to children in danger. This kind of sustained community engagement is unusual. It requires organization, leadership, and commitment. It requires people to keep showing up even when there's no new information, no progress, no reason to believe tonight will be different from last night. But they showed up anyway, because that's what communities do when they function properly. They hold each other through difficulty. They refuse to let tragedies be forgotten. They insist that these lives mattered, that these disappearances aren't just statistics or cold cases, but human beings who deserve to be found. The fact that the search and vigils have continued for more than 2 decades speaks to both the family's determination and the community's loyalty. Many cases fade from public consciousness within months. The families continue searching, but the wider world moves on. The Bradley case has avoided that fate partly because Tionda Bradley Smith has made it her life's work to keep it visible, and partly because the community has decided these girls deserve to be remembered. This is how missing persons cases stay alive. not through law enforcement alone, though their continued effort matters, but through communities refusing to forget, through families refusing to be silent, through annual vigils and social media posts and conversations that keep the names alive. Tionda Bradley, Diamond Bradley. Say their names. Remember their faces. Someone knows something. Someone always knows something. The question is whether that someone will ever speak. The technological changes since 2001 have also impacted the case. When the girls disappeared, social media barely existed. MySpace was in its infancy. Facebook didn't launch until 2004. There was no Twitter, no Instagram, no TikTok. The ability to share information instantly with thousands of people didn't exist the way it does now. The family relied on traditional media, flyers, word of mouth. Now, they have multiple Facebook pages dedicated to the girls. Shalia posts updates regularly. The case has been covered by true crime podcasts and YouTube channels, reaching audiences that wouldn't have been exposed to the story through traditional media. Age-progressed photos can be shared thousands of times within hours. The 2023 TikTok claim from the woman saying she was Diamond went viral, bringing renewed attention to the case. This is both beneficial and challenging. More visibility means more potential tips, but it also means more false leads, more people inserting themselves into the narrative for attention, more noise that investigators have to sift through to find actual signal. The MySpace photo in 2008 that looked like Tionda generated enormous hope and significant resources spent investigating, only to turn out to be someone else entirely. The 2019 Facebook message from someone claiming to be trying to come home turned out to be a scam. These false leads are emotionally devastating. Each one requires the family to open themselves to hope, which means opening themselves to the possibility of disappointment. And each disappointment reinforces the reality that the girls probably aren't coming home, that 20+ years is too long, that whatever happened on July 6, 2001, likely ended with the girls' deaths. But the family can't fully accept that possibility because without bodies, without confirmation, there's always the theoretical chance that they're wrong, that the girls are alive somewhere, that someday they'll come home. This is the torture of ambiguous loss. You can't grieve properly because you can't confirm the death. But you can't fully hope either because the odds are overwhelming that hoping is just delaying inevitable acceptance of a terrible truth. The case has also entered the realm of true crime entertainment, which raises ethical questions about how we consume tragedy. True crime as a genre has exploded in recent decades. Podcasts, documentaries, YouTube channels, books, all dedicated to exploring murders and disappearances and other violent crimes. There's something compelling about these stories. They speak to our fascination with mortality, with evil, with the fragile line between safety and catastrophe. But they also turn real people's suffering into content, into entertainment that people listen to while commuting or working out or doing dishes. The Bradley family has participated in various true crime productions, understanding that visibility might lead to tips, might keep the case alive in public consciousness. But there's something uncomfortable about knowing your family's worst trauma has become entertainment for millions of strangers. Some will listen with genuine empathy, hoping to help. Others consume these stories the way they'd consume fiction, emotionally engaged but not actually invested in real outcomes. And some listen with an almost voyeuristic fascination, drawn to the darkness without fully considering that these are real children, real lives destroyed, real families left in permanent limbo. The ethics of true crime entertainment are complex. On one hand, these productions serve a purpose. They generate awareness. They sometimes lead to solutions. There are cases that went cold for years until a podcast or documentary renewed interest and generated the tip that solved it. On the other hand, there's something exploitative about turning grief into content, about generating revenue from stories of dead and missing children. Where's the line between respectful documentation and ghoulish entertainment? It's not always clear. What is clear is that the Bradley family has decided visibility is worth the discomfort. They need people talking about this case. They need the names Tionda and Diamond to remain in circulation. They need someone who knows something to see the age-progressed photos or hear the family's plea and decide to finally speak. If that means their story becomes entertainment, so be it. The goal is finding the girls or finding answers, and if true crime consumption helps achieve that goal, the cost is acceptable. The legal obstacles to prosecuting someone for these disappearances, even if investigators are certain who's responsible, are substantial. Without bodies, it's difficult but not impossible to prosecute a murder case. These are called no-body homicide cases, and they require circumstantial evidence strong enough to prove beyond reasonable doubt that the person is dead and that the defendant killed them. It can be done. There are successful prosecutions without bodies, but they're challenging, and they require either a confession, multiple witnesses, or an overwhelming accumulation of forensic and circumstantial evidence. In the Bradley case, there's no confession. George Washington has maintained he had nothing to do with the disappearance. There are no witnesses who saw him harm the girls or dispose of their bodies. The evidence is circumstantial: suspicious purchases, suspicious phone activity, suspicious burns, suspicious gaps in timeline, suspicious hair in trunk. All suspicious, but individually explainable. A defense attorney would argue reasonable doubt on every point. Collectively, the evidence suggests guilt to many observers. But suggesting and proving are different standards, especially in criminal court where the burden is on the prosecution to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt, not on the defense to prove innocence. The other challenge is the passage of time. Witnesses die, move away, or forget. Evidence degrades. The ability to reconstruct timelines from July 2001 becomes more difficult every year. People's memories of what happened 24 years ago are unreliable at best. If someone came forward today claiming to have seen something relevant in 2001, could they testify credibly? Could they remember details accurately enough to withstand cross-examination? Probably not. Time is the enemy of prosecution, which is why cold cases are so difficult to solve. The longer it's been, the harder it gets. There are also questions about jurisdiction and resources. The Chicago Police Department remains the lead agency, but the FBI has been involved since the beginning. Multiple jurisdictions mean multiple bureaucracies, multiple chains of command, multiple priorities. What's urgent to one agency might not be to another. Resources get allocated based on numerous factors: solvability, public pressure, political considerations, availability of personnel. A cold case from 2001 competes with new cases for attention and resources. This doesn't mean investigators don't care. Many do, deeply. Ed Carroll and Pam Childs have devoted significant time to this case, even after retirement or despite other responsibilities. But caring isn't the same as having the resources to investigate effectively. Modern forensic techniques offer some hope. DNA analysis has improved dramatically since 2001. Genetic genealogy has solved cases that seemed impossible. If there's biological evidence from the scene or from any potential location where the girls were taken, modern testing might extract information that wasn't accessible 20 years ago. But you need evidence to test. The hair in George Washington's trunk was tested and found to match the maternal line, but that doesn't definitively tell us whose hair it was or when it got there. If there's clothing or other items with biological evidence that's been stored properly, retesting with modern techniques might reveal new information. But 24 years of storage, especially if evidence wasn't preserved under ideal conditions, may have degraded anything that might have been useful. The same is true for fingerprints, fibers, any physical evidence that might exist somewhere in evidence storage. Touch DNA, the ability to extract DNA from skin cells left on objects, has improved significantly. If there are items from the apartment or from George's home or vehicle that were collected but never tested with modern techniques, that's a potential avenue for new leads. But again, this assumes evidence still exists, was properly preserved, and hasn't degraded beyond usability. The DNA testing of the woman who claimed in 2023 to be Diamond represents the most recent potential breakthrough. If the results come back positive, if this woman is actually Diamond Bradley, it would be the first major break in the case in more than 2 decades. It would confirm that at least one of the girls survived. It would mean there's a living witness who can potentially provide information about what happened. Even if her memories are incomplete or fragmented, as is common in childhood trauma, she might know things that could help locate Tionda or identify who took them. She said she remembered being in a car with another girl, possibly Tionda. She said one day she woke up and her sister was gone. She claimed she recently escaped from whoever was holding her. If true, this is an extraordinary story. It means the girls were abducted and held somewhere for years. It means Tionda might have been killed at some point, or is still being held, or was sold or given to someone else. It opens up possibilities that are both hopeful and horrifying. But as of early 2024, the DNA results haven't been publicly released. This could mean they're still being processed, though that seems unlikely given how long it's been since the woman came forward. It could mean the results are back and show she's not Diamond, and authorities are trying to figure out how to handle the announcement without causing more pain to the family. It could mean the results show she is Diamond, and there's now an active criminal investigation that requires secrecy. Or it could mean the woman withdrew her claim, refused further testing, or disappeared before results could be finalized. Without official confirmation, the family remains in limbo. Shalia said she's cautiously hopeful, but has been disappointed too many times to fully invest in this possibility. All I can do is hope it is her, she said. But hope has become heavy after 24 years of carrying it. The generational impact of this case continues to unfold. Rita and Victoria's children will grow up knowing about their aunts who disappeared. They'll attend vigils, see photos, hear stories about girls who existed before they were born. They'll absorb the family's grief and vigilance, learning that safety is temporary, that people you love can vanish without explanation, that some questions never get answered. This is trauma inheritance. The direct impact on Rita and Victoria, who were there, who remember their sisters, who carry survivors' guilt and the burden of being the ones who remained, is obvious. But trauma doesn't stop with the generation that experienced it. It ripples forward, affecting children and grandchildren who have no direct memory of the event but grow up in its shadow. They learn to be hypervigilant. They learn not to trust easily. They learn that the world is dangerous in ways that go beyond typical childhood fears. This isn't necessarily bad. Being aware of danger is protective. But when that awareness becomes all-consuming, when it prevents normal development and trust building, it becomes its own kind of harm. The Bradley family's younger generation will have to find ways to honor their missing aunts while not allowing that loss to define their entire existence. This is a difficult balance. How do you remember without being consumed by remembering? How do you stay vigilant without becoming paralyzed? How do you grieve people you never knew while still living your own life? These are questions the family will be working through for generations, long after Tionda and Diamond's case is resolved or remains unsolved. The role of faith in sustaining the family is also significant. The annual vigils are explicitly religious, incorporating gospel hymns and prayers. Tracy Bradley lifts her hands when she sings, reaching towards something beyond human understanding. For many families dealing with unsolvable tragedies, faith becomes the framework that makes continued existence possible. If you believe in a higher power, if you believe there's purpose in suffering even when you can't see it, if you believe in an afterlife where you'll be reunited with loved ones, grief becomes bearable in ways it wouldn't be otherwise. This isn't to say non-religious families can't cope with loss. They can and do. But religious faith provides specific coping mechanisms, communal ritual, theological explanation, eschatological hope, that can be powerful tools for managing unbearable circumstances. The Bradley family's faith doesn't mean they're passive. They're actively searching, attending vigils, managing social media, following leads. But their faith provides the foundation that makes this active searching sustainable over decades rather than burning out after months or years. The belief that God sees what happened, that justice will eventually come even if not in this life, that Tionda and Diamond are in a better place if they've died. These beliefs don't answer practical questions about who took the girls and where their bodies are. But they answer the existential question of how to continue living when something this terrible has happened. For many people, that's enough. It has to be enough, because there's no alternative that allows continued functioning. The case has also become a touchstone for discussions about systemic failures in protecting Black children. The initial response was unusually robust, but the quick shift of attention after September 11th reflects a broader pattern of Black missing persons cases receiving less sustained attention than cases involving white victims. This disparity is well documented. Missing white woman syndrome is a real phenomenon where media coverage, public interest, and resource allocation skew heavily toward cases involving white females, particularly white children and young women. Cases involving Black, Indigenous, or other minority victims often receive minimal coverage, smaller searches, fewer resources. The Bradley case cut through this pattern initially because of the girls' ages, the community's organizing, and Shalia's persistence. But maintaining that attention has required constant work. The family has had to continually re-advocate, re-publicize, re-demand that people care about these girls. They shouldn't have to do this. Every missing child should receive maximum effort regardless of their race, neighborhood, or family circumstances. But they don't. And so families like the Bradleys bear the additional burden of not just grieving and searching, but also fighting to make people care, fighting against implicit biases that devalue Black lives, fighting to make their children visible in a society that often overlooks them. This is exhausting. It's also necessary. If Shalia Bradley Smith had given up years ago, if she'd stopped posting on Facebook, stopped organizing vigils, stopped talking to journalists, the case would have faded completely from public consciousness. The persistence is what keeps it alive. But that persistence shouldn't be necessary. The system should work regardless of whether families have the energy, ability, and resources to maintain pressure. That it doesn't work this way reflects systemic racism that operates in subtle and not so subtle ways throughout the criminal justice system. There's also the question of what constitutes closure in a case like this. For some families, finding remains provides closure even when there's no prosecution. Knowing what happened, being able to bury your loved one, having concrete confirmation rather than uncertainty, allows grief to progress in healthier ways. For other families, closure requires prosecution. It requires someone being held accountable, justice being served, the person responsible facing consequences. For still others, closure isn't possible regardless of outcomes. The loss is too profound. The wound never heals. It just becomes something you learn to live with. The Bradley family has expressed both desires. They want to find the girls, alive if possible, their remains if not. They want prosecution. They want someone held accountable. But more than anything, they want answers. They want to know what happened. Who took them? Why? Where they are now. Whether they suffered. Whether they knew what was happening. Whether they called out for their mother. Whether they were scared. These are the questions that haunt families of missing persons. The not knowing is torture. Even terrible knowledge is preferable to uncertainty, because at least with knowledge you can begin to process, to grieve, to eventually move forward. Without knowledge, you're frozen, perpetually waiting for information that might never come. This is what the Bradley family has lived with for 24 years. This is what they'll continue living with until someone speaks, until evidence emerges, until something changes that provides answers. And if those answers never come, they'll live with it until they die, passing the burden of not knowing to the next generation, who will pass it to the generation after that, an inheritance of grief that spans time. The statistical reality is grim. Most missing children who aren't found within the first 48 hours are eventually found deceased. After 2 weeks, the likelihood of finding them alive drops to nearly zero. After 24 years, the chances approach zero absolutely. But nearly zero and zero are different things. As long as there's any possibility, however remote, families cling to it. This is human nature. We need hope to survive, even when hope is statistically unreasonable. The Bradley family knows the statistics. They're not naive. Shalia said they're looking for the girls as adults or for remains. She knows it's more likely they're looking for remains. But she continues searching for adults anyway, continues holding vigils, continues posting on social media, continues believing that somehow, some way, this story might have a different ending than probability suggests. This isn't delusion. It's survival. It's the only way to continue living after something this catastrophic without completely breaking down. There are cases where people were found alive after decades. Elizabeth Smart was missing for 9 months before being found alive. J.C. Dugard was missing for 18 years. The women held captive by Ariel Castro in Cleveland were missing for about a decade. These cases are exceptional, but they exist. They prove that nearly zero isn't zero. And as long as there are exceptions, as long as there are cases where people beat the odds, families have rational reason to maintain hope even when that hope seems irrational. The Bradley family story is ultimately about love persisting through unbearable circumstances. It's about a great aunt who sat in a parking lot for a week watching for her nieces. About sisters who carry guilt for not being there. About a mother who, regardless of her choices or knowledge, lost 2 children and has had to live with that loss for more than 2 decades. About a community that continues showing up every July 6th to release balloons and sing hymns. About investigators who work cold cases pro bono because they can't let go of children they never met. About a society that fails Black families in systematic ways, and about families who refuse to accept that failure is final. It's a story without an ending, at least not yet. The girls are still missing. Someone still knows something. And the family still waits, still hopes, still searches, still believes that someday they'll have answers. This is both heartbreaking and inspiring. Heartbreaking because it reflects a grief that never resolves. Inspiring because it demonstrates the human capacity to endure unendurable things, to maintain love in the absence of its object, to refuse surrender even when victory seems impossible. 24 years is a long time to wait. But for the Bradley family, waiting is all they can do. So they wait. They hold vigil. They release balloons. They post on Facebook. They answer calls from journalists and true crime enthusiasts. They attend vigils on 90-degree July days wearing t-shirts with their daughters' faces printed on them. They hold hands and pray and hope and refuse to forget. Because forgetting feels like betrayal. Because Tionda and Diamond deserve to be remembered. Because someone knows something. Because the truth matters even when the truth is terrible. Because giving up means accepting that some things can't be solved, some wounds can't be healed, some children can't be found. And that acceptance feels like death itself, so they resist it with everything they have. As of 2026, the case remains open. New leads are followed when they come in. The investigation, such as it is, continues at the pace that cold cases continue, which is to say slowly, intermittently, with long periods of dormancy punctuated by brief surges of activity when something new emerges. The family maintains their Facebook pages. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children keeps updated age-progressed photos in circulation. Law enforcement maintains the case in their databases. But there's been no significant break, no arrest, no discovery of remains, no dramatic resolution that would allow the family to finally know what happened to their girls. Tionda Bradley would now be 34 years old. Born January 20th, 1991, she would be a woman in the prime of her life. She might have graduated college, might have a career, might be married with children of her own. If she's alive, she's lived more than 2 decades away from her family, 2 decades of birthdays and Christmases and ordinary Tuesdays that her family knows nothing about. If she's dead, she's been gone for nearly 25 years, her body hidden somewhere that has eluded multiple searches, her life cut short before she had chance to become the woman she might have been. Diamond Bradley would now be 27 years old. Born November 25, 1997, she barely got to experience childhood before it was stolen from her. 3 years old when she disappeared, she wouldn't have had time to form many memories of her life before. If she's alive somewhere, does she remember her mother? Her sisters? Her apartment on Lake Grove Village? Or have those memories faded into vague impressions, feelings without concrete images, a sense of having once belonged somewhere else without being able to recall the details? If she's dead, she never got to experience school, friendships, first loves, career aspirations, any of the markers of a life fully lived. Her existence was reduced to 3 years, most of which she was too young to remember. The age-progressed photos of both girls show attractive young women with confident expressions. The forensic artists who create these images use family photos, understanding of genetic traits, and knowledge of how faces change with age to project what missing children might look like years later. They're useful tools for identification. But they're also speculative portraits, best guesses based on probability and genetic patterns. The real Tionda and Diamond, if they're alive, might look nothing like these projections. They might have gained or lost weight, changed their hairstyle, developed scars, or distinctive marks. Life shapes faces in ways that can't be predicted. Stress, illness, happiness, trauma, all leave traces. The women Tionda and Diamond became, if they became women, might be completely unrecognizable from the children they were and from the projections of who they might be. This is the challenge of long-term missing persons cases. The person you're looking for has changed, assuming they're still alive to change. You're not searching for a 10-year-old and a 3-year-old anymore. You're searching for women in their 20s and 30s, and you don't know what they look like, what names they might be using, what circumstances they might be living in. It's searching for ghosts, for theoretical people who may or may not exist, based on projections and hope. Identifying physical characteristics can help. Tionda had a quarter-size scar on her left forearm. Diamond had a scar on the left side of her head and her hairline. These are the kinds of markers that don't change with age, that could help identify someone decades later. If Tionda or Diamond walked into a police station tomorrow claiming to be who they are, those scars would help confirm their identity even before DNA testing. But they have to walk into a police station first. They have to know they're missing. They have to remember enough about their previous life to understand that they belong somewhere else. And if they're being held against their will, or if they were adopted illegally and don't know their true identity, or if they were killed decades ago, those scars won't help anyone. The family's advice to anyone with information is simple and has remained consistent for 24 years. Call the Chicago Police Department at 312-747-5789. Call the FBI Illinois office at 312-421-6700. Call the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children at 1-800-THELOST. Any information, no matter how insignificant it might seem, could be the piece that makes everything else fall into place. Maybe you saw something on July 6, 2001. That didn't seem important at the time, but looking back now feels significant. Maybe you heard someone say something years ago that you dismissed, but now wonder about. Maybe you know someone whose behavior changed around that time, who suddenly had access to money they shouldn't have had, who moved away abruptly, who seemed different afterward. Maybe you're reading this and realizing you might be Tionda or Diamond, that details of your own life story don't quite add up, that you have scars in the right places, and you've always felt like you belonged somewhere else. Whatever you know, whatever you suspect, whatever fragmented piece of information you have, it could matter. It could be the difference between this case remaining unsolved forever and finally bringing these girls home. The reward still stands. $10,000 for information leading to the girls' whereabouts. Money isn't the primary motivator for most people who come forward with information in cases like this, but it's there as an additional incentive, a recognition that helping solve this case has value. More important than money is conscience. If you know something, and you've remained silent for 24 years, that silence has weight. It sits in your chest. It invades your dreams. It's the thing you think about late at night when you can't sleep. Coming forward won't erase that weight, but it might lighten it. It might allow you to finally exhale. And it would give a family answers they've waited decades to receive. The possibility that someone will read this and come forward is small. Most people who know something have already decided silence is preferable to speaking. They've lived with that decision for years. They've rationalized it, justified it, built their lives around it. Asking them to dismantle all of that and face consequences they've spent decades avoiding is asking a lot. But people do confess. Guilty consciences become unbearable. Relationships end and secrets get revealed. New evidence emerges that makes keeping quiet more dangerous than speaking up. People get sick and decide to clear their conscience before dying. Someone who was a child in 2001 and saw something they didn't understand might now be an adult who realizes what they witnessed was significant. Change happens. Information emerges. Cases get solved decades after they go cold. It's rare, but it happens. The Bradley family is hoping this will be one of those cases. They're hoping that someone, somewhere, will decide that 24 years is long enough, that these girls deserve to be found, that their family deserves answers, that keeping silent is no longer tenable. They're hoping that this article, or a documentary, or an anniversary news story, or an age-progressed photo shared on social media, will reach that person and give them the push they need to finally speak. They're hoping that today might be the day everything changes. This hope has sustained them for 8,000+ days. It sustained them through the initial frantic search and the agonizing weeks that followed. Through the first anniversary, and the 10th, and the 20th, and now the 24th. Through false leads, and dashed hopes, and bureaucratic frustrations. Through moments when giving up seemed like the only sane response and moments when hope felt cruel rather than comforting. Through all of it, they've maintained this single thread of belief: someone knows something. Someday, that someone will speak. Until then, they wait. On July 6, 2026, the family will gather again. They'll meet near the 35th Street Bridge or at Robert Taylor Park or another location with meaning to this story. They'll bring balloons in various colors, each one representing something: hope or grief or divine love or years past. They'll wear t-shirts and buttons with Tionda and Diamond's faces printed on them. The faces of children who no longer exist, who have either aged into unrecognizable women or died and decomposed into bone and memory. They'll hold hands, family and friends and community members who have adopted this cause as their own. They'll sing gospel hymns, their voices rising into the Chicago summer air the same way they've risen for 25 consecutive years. They'll pray for answers, for justice, for peace, for the impossible miracle of their girls coming home. And then they'll release the balloons, watching as they drift upward and away, carrying prayers and hopes, and the names of two little girls toward whatever lies beyond the visible sky. The balloons will eventually fall back to earth, deflated and forgotten, caught in trees or tangled in power lines, or littering some street far from where they were released. But in the moment of release, they're transcendent. They're physical manifestations of hope that maybe, this time, prayers will be answered. Maybe this time, someone will see the news coverage and decide to call. Maybe this time, the truth will finally emerge from whatever darkness has concealed it for more than 2 decades. This ritual will repeat until it doesn't, until either the case is solved or the generation that remembers the girls firsthand ages out and dies, passing the burden of remembering to younger relatives who never knew Tionda and Diamond personally. Eventually, everyone who remembers them alive will be gone. Their existence will be reduced to photographs and news articles and true crime retellings, sanitized versions of real lives lived briefly and then interrupted by violence or abandonment or whatever happened that July morning in 2001. But that eventual forgetting is still years away. For now, the family remembers. The community remembers. Chicago remembers. And in that remembering, Tionda and Diamond remain alive in some meaningful sense. Not the girls they were or the women they might have become, but as symbols of all the children who disappear without explanation, all the families left waiting, all the cases that resist resolution despite years of effort. Before we close, remember that if you have any information at all about the disappearance of Tionda and Diamond Bradley, please contact the Chicago Police Department at 312-747-5789, the FBI Illinois office at 312-421-6700, or the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children at 1-800-THE-LOST. These girls deserve to be found. This family deserves answers. And whoever is responsible deserves to face justice for what they did. Thank you for watching and for caring enough about these girls to stay until the end. If you found this story meaningful, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who might help keep Tionda and Diamond's story alive. The more people who know about this case, the greater the chance that someone with information will finally come forward. Every share, every view, every conversation sparked by this video brings us one step closer to the day when the Bradley family can finally stop waiting and start healing. Until then, they wait, and we wait with them, refusing to forget 2 little girls who disappeared on a summer morning in Chicago and haven't been seen since. Tionda Bradley, Diamond Bradley, missing since July 6, 2001. Someone knows something. Somewhere, the truth is waiting to be told. And someday, perhaps someday soon, that truth will finally emerge. And this story will have the ending a family has waited more than 2 decades to receive.